Hello, my name is Bill Whalen, and I'm the chair of the Board of Trustees of the Gregorian University Foundation. On behalf of my fellow trustees, I welcome you to this fifth installment of the Distinguished Lecture Series presented by the Gregorian University Foundation. We are confident that you will find our speakers and timely topic very stimulating and informative. The mission of our foundation is to raise funds here in the United States to support the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, including its renowned constituent institutes, the Biblicum Institute and the Orientale Institute. The Pontifical Gregorian University, known informally as the Greg, is the birthplace of Jesuit education, started by St. Ignatius Loyola himself in 1551. It educates women and men, lay and religious, who come from the United States and around the world and return to their homelands to lead their parishes, schools, seminaries, orders, and dioceses. We think of this cycle as having a multiplier effect of this first-class education throughout the world. In addition to undergraduate and graduate degrees in philosophy, canon law, and theology, students also focus on solving real-world problems such as child protection, interreligious dialogue, integral ecology, ethics, artificial intelligence, and leadership and management for churches, universities, hospitals, and other Catholic institutions. The Greg has remained a world-class Jesuit university for almost 500 years, and today is one of the most important works of the Society of Jesus worldwide. The Greg is where the church is doing some of its best work, and it is heavily dependent on the support that we provide, and we are heavily dependent on you, our loyal benefactors. I hope you enjoyed today's lecture. I would now like to introduce you to the president of our foundation, Father Tom Merkel of the Society of Jesus.
Thank you, Bill. Very much appreciated. And thank you to all who are here to enjoy and profit from our guests this evening. We have Father Sam Sawyer and Father Christian Sains, who will lead us in a conversation about how the conclave shapes world history. We're delighted to have both of you. We thank you, Father Christian and Father Sam, for being with us. Father Sam Sawyer is the editor-in-chief of America Media, where he's worked since 2015. And since 2020, he has also served as the local superior of the America House Jesuit community in New York. He assists at the Church of St. Francis Xavier, and he is trustee of the Gregorian University Foundation. During his theology studies, he helped to found the Jesuit Post and served as one of its first editors. During his Jesuit formation, Father Sawyer studied philosophy at Loyola University, Chicago, and his theology at Boston College. And Father Christian Sains was born and raised in Miami, Florida, to Colombian parents. He said his lifelong faith journey was nurtured by Catholic education, first at St. Hugh's School and later at Belen Jesuit Preparatory School. After graduating from Belen, he continued his studies at Syracuse University in New York, obtaining a bachelor's degree in international relations and Italian language. 2 years after graduation, he entered the Jesuits and began his formation at the Jesuit novitiate in Santiago, Dominican Republic. He continued his studies at Fordham University, a Jesuit university in New York, and graduated with a master's in philosophy in 2006. After graduation, he worked at Belen as a social studies teacher for 2 years, and afterward went to the Pontifical Gregorian University, where he earned a baccalaureate in sacred theology in 2011 and stayed until completing his doctorate in church history. After he earned his doctorate, he taught church history and Latin at St. Vincent de Paul Regional Seminary in Boynton Beach, Florida, for 5 years. He returned to the Gregorian University as an instructor in church history and Latin. So once again, Father Christian and Father Sam, thank you for your presence here with us tonight. We appreciate what you'll help us to think and grow in our own thinking around the way that the conclave shapes world history. So to begin and to allow you guys to have dialogue back and forth, just perhaps you could start by sharing what was the conclave like for you, and where were you during the conclave, and what?
Well, certainly, I was at a very privileged place. I was in Rome, and for the second time, I was in the plaza the day of the election. And there was a lot of surprises or curveballs, they'd say, were thrown that day because I never thought it was going to happen so soon, or it would have been the election would have occurred so soon. It was practically 24 hours from the first vote till the final vote. And I was telling everybody, "No, this is going to go on for a couple of days. Nobody knows each other, and yeah, this should drag on." Well, I was wrong on that count. I was there in the plaza when the announcement was made, the Habemus Papam, and just like for the election of Pope Francis, my jaw hit the floor, hit the floor of the plaza, because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The first time I was there for the election of Pope Francis, I couldn't believe I was hearing Cardinal Jorge Bergoglio, because I said, well, it's impossible. A Jesuit can't be Pope. Well, there you had him. And the second time around, when I heard it very clearly, Cardinal Robert Prevost, I was like, well, I heard wrong. An American can't be Pope. And my jaw dropped down for the second time around. And so that it was certainly a momentous occasion to be there and to hear that and to be part of that and amongst a sea of people. And especially in historical context, is to see how that certainly has shattered, I think, some sort of bias that might have occurred up until now, because it was strange that sentiment, that thought that a U.S. born prelate could never become pope, or we would not have a pope from the U.S. Seems to have been rather accepted. And if you look at a lot of the interviews that were done even to the day before the conclave by cardinals that were going to participate in it on all the major networks, the question that would always come up is, what about the possibility of the U.S. Pope? And all of them would dismiss it right away with the greatest of ease. And it was something that was largely accepted, I'd say. It's something that was largely accepted in Rome as well. When even that idea would come up, it was considered almost a joke. I mean, they made a song about it some years ago about the Papa Americano. And so it was largely dismissed to have that possibility. But I think perhaps an acceptable bias has been overcome right now with the election of our Pope Leo the 14th. It was a bias that a lot of times was based on, well, the U.S. is too powerful. It can't have it can't have the papacy as well. But certainly we find ourselves in an interesting moment right now. Father Sam, how do you think the idea of a U.S. Pope weighs with you?
Well, so just where I was during the conclave, particularly, so I was also in the square, but I had arrived, with a team from America Media. We had about 9 of us there total, to cover the conclave and communicate it back home. And so I spent those 2.5 weeks in Rome staying right near the Greg at the Biblicum. That's the Jesuit community I was living in. But I had gone over to of course, near the Vatican to help cover it. We had an Airbnb that a couple of our lay editors were staying at that we used as our makeshift newsroom. I was there waiting for what we thought would be black smoke that night. As Father Christian says, we were all very surprised at how quickly the election concluded. And so when I saw white smoke, I immediately got up, headed over towards the square, texting the booker from CNN on the way to say, I'm here. You can put me on whenever you need me, because a lot of what we were doing there was providing commentary for the secular media. And so I found myself standing right next to the risers that the big news channels were working from um, during waiting for the habemus papam from the balcony and waiting to find out who it was. And I remember, so it's sort of a meditative moment waiting for that, joyful and expectant as well. But I remember thinking at that moment, we at America Magazine, we've been the Jesuit magazine explaining the Jesuit Pope. And whatever happens next, like that roller coaster ride is over, is basically what I was feeling like. And I kind of thought, whatever happens next will not be as exciting. And then all of a sudden, we're the American Catholic magazine explaining the American Pope to the world. So the roller coaster went right back up to the top of the hill. But yeah, really, I think the fact that we elected an American, I mean, in a lot of ways, I think that's that can be kind of a deceptive question. Um, and we could talk more about why that is. But I think in order to help maybe put it into historical context, I think Father Christian's going to talk to us a little bit about how the church has previously understood the nationality of the papacy back and forth.
Certainly, yeah. In history, the idea of an international, I'm calling it an international papacy, to set it apart from what has largely been an Italian papacy and dominated by candidates and popes from the Italian peninsula for well over 1,000 years. It was practically 400 years, I believe, right before the last non-Italian pope had been elected before St. John Paul II. And so in a sort of way, our default is to go to an Italian papacy, as was the case, and I don't know if you felt it in Rome. I mean, there was, I think, a large expectation, a popular expectation that it was going to be an Italian this time. I mean, your safe money would have been betting on some of the Italian candidates that were there. And so on one side, there was this expectation. He's the Bishop of Rome, so it's assumed that it might be someone local. However, looking throughout the course of our history, of the history of the church, and as the church starts to become more universal in that sense, and I'm talking about, we got to go back 1,700 years. We got to go back to the 4th century, to the time of Constantine, where the Bishop of Rome starts to really stand out, not just in a religious sense and an internal sense of the church, but also with a political backing, which is the Roman Empire. It really starts to make the Pope in the way we can recognize it today. And he becomes an international figure. I would say first, at the beginning, it would have been within the context of a very multinational Roman Empire. Certainly at the time of Constantine, we have it attested at least to 3 African popes of African origin, which would have meant Northern Africa, probably Tunisia, what is today Tunisia, would have been that province of Northern Africa where they came from. And it showed a very deep connection between Rome and the provinces of Northern Africa, that, well, the Bishop of Rome would be someone from there. And some customs and a lot of things had been imported over time. And then we kind of changed to this moment to largely from a papacy that is from the city. And it is a multinational city. It's a city that is very international still today. I remember one time riding in a cab in Rome and messing up something in Italian. I had been in Rome already for 5 years, and I said, "Oh, I feel bad. I've been here so long, and I'm still making the same mistakes." And the cabbie goes to me and goes, "Father, people have been coming here from all the centuries for so many thousands of years, and they've been messing up Latin all the way. They've been messing up Italian. Don't worry, you're part of the mix. You're part of the salad." And so to see that's it. Those who come into Rome form part of something a lot greater. And in the historical context, we see will also start shaping that. I'm thinking in medieval times when you had a papacy that left Rome and went to France, and we had a succession of French popes. It does kind of signal where there's a center of influence, a power center, if you will, of politics, but also of religion in an ecclesial sense. Certain nationalities, what we would define today as nationalities, start to signal out. And certainly in the medieval period, you start seeing this internationalization when we have such a thing called the Holy Roman Empire, which is comprised of what would be France, it would be Germany, and would be Belgium, Netherlands, and different modern countries today. You start seeing popes that were coming from German origin, from what would be Lotharingian, which would be around Belgium and France, the origin coming in and reflecting that growth and that society.
So maybe we can talk a little bit about what Leo's Americanness might mean or might not mean in this context. So I really appreciate what Father Christian has offered from the history to remind us how much the shape and the understood nationality of the papacy has changed over time, how often it has been woven in and out of the political power structures of the eras in which it's been found. And certainly I think that's, as Father Christian's already commented, that's behind in the background of a lot of the assumption that we would not have an American Pope during the same period as the American political system was, the major power in the world. But I also think that one of the interesting things about Leo, about former Cardinal Robert Prevost specifically, is that there's a sense in which, at least from a first draft of history at the level done by journalists, there's a sense in which the question of what does it mean for him to be an American, that question's a little bit misleading, because what we've heard, at least so far, from the cardinals who were voting is that they were not intentionally prioritizing either for or against his Americanness. Cardinal McElroy, the Archbishop of Washington, said explicitly that his Americanness simply was not a factor for most of the cardinals, as he understood it in the discussions before and during the conclave. So I would say, we should make the distinction that we can't ask why did the cardinals want an American pope, because it's pretty clear that that's not why they selected him. The Italian press referred to him as the least American of the Americans, because he had already been a citizen of the world. He was, he had spent years in Peru as a missionary. Then he was twice elected prior general of the Augustinians, so based in Rome, but with a worldwide portfolio. I think he's probably the best traveled person to ever be elected pope. Popes have traveled significantly, starting with John Paul II especially, but Prevost has already done a lot of that traveling before he became Leo. So, in that sense, and then he was, of course, back to Peru as a bishop. So he's got, his background is much broader than just being from the United States, even though that is, of course, his native territory. But I think we can ask, even if we can't ask, why did the Cardinals want an American Pope? Because it seems that they didn't. They wanted this Pope. They wanted Prevost. We can ask why they wanted, what qualities he had that they wanted, and how his being American helped shape him, and thus might help shape the church during his ministry as the successor of Peter. I would also add one other caveat here when talking about what the Cardinals want. Of course, what the cardinals want is not automatically identical with how God works through the process of the election and how the Holy Spirit moves in the selection of the new pope. But it is the part that we can get at with the reporting. So that's the part we're going to speak from. And so just to comment briefly, I would say that there are a few things that were clear during the conclave. A lot of the sort of horse race coverage that you were seeing certainly in the secular media and sometimes even in the Catholic media, was kind of asking this, is the next pope going to be in continuity with Francis? It seems in the aftermath of the conclave that we can say pretty clearly that wasn't a real live wire question for the cardinals. They weren't asking whether or not to proceed in continuity with Francis. They were asking how to proceed in continuity with Francis. But the continuity with Francis seems to have been pretty deeply baked in from what the cardinals have said. And so I would compare that, to the recent conclaves. 2005, the conclave that elected Benedict the 16th to succeed John Paul II. That was very direct continuity with John Paul II. Ratzinger had been, one of his primary collaborators, was the dean of the College of Cardinals, was elected very quickly. 2013, the conclave that elected Francis after Benedict's resignation. I certainly wouldn't see 2013 in any way as a rejection of Benedict's papacy, but I think there was a sense that it was a pivot, that the church needed new gifts to face new challenges, that Benedict, both due to some of his frailty and also, his own recognition that he was not the right person to continue leading the church at that moment. And of course, you have Francis's famous description in his pre-conclave speech that was released later of a church closed in on itself and unhealthy and needing to go out from itself in a missionary dimension. But I think this conclave very much wanted to continue that project of the church going out from itself, its missionary discipleship, and synodality as a constitutive way of doing that. So in that sense, I see this conclave and Leo emerging very much in continuity with the arc of the way the conclaves since Vatican II have unfolded. Certainly Francis put a big emphasis on synodality as the way the church would continue to live out the gift of the Second Vatican Council. Leo made that explicit in his speech to the cardinals just 2 days after he was elected, that Saturday morning. But I think it's also interesting to look at where the church has found its shepherds since Vatican II. Paul VI, of course, an Italian, carrying on. John Paul I, very briefly, an Italian, carrying on that tradition. But then a pivot from Italy to Europe with John Paul II, and then continuing with Benedict, Poland and Germany. Then electing a South American, but of Italian heritage. Francis's Bergoglio's parents are Italian immigrants, but this Pope is from Argentina and is an Argentinian. And now we have a South American of U.S. heritage, a Peruvian citizen, but born in the U.S., who's lived on mission. So it's also interesting to me that this follows sort of a similar chronological pattern in a way as the missionary activity of the church. So when the church reached the New World, first, in the Spanish expansion and Spanish colonial territories in South America, and then those churches started generating their own clergy and became not mission territories, but fully fledged local churches. And then that happened a little bit later in the U.S. because, of course, founded by largely Protestant colonial powers, it took the U.S. Catholic Church a little while longer to bootstrap itself and cease to be a mission territory. That happened in the early 20th century. And we've sort of followed that same temporal pattern in when we've gotten a pope from the Latin American church and then a pope from the U.S. church, which I think is, I mean, I don't want to suggest this is a grand theory and therefore the next pope will be from or anything like that. But I think it is interesting that as we see these local churches maturing, we also see them giving us popes eventually. But of course, there's a tension there too, because the question of what it means for a pope to come from a country that isn't basically Catholic at its roots, right? The U.S., of course, has been in tension over its history with the Catholic Church precisely because of the U.S. model of religious freedom. And the way Americans understand citizenship and understand political power. So I wonder, Father Christian, if you could say a little bit about how that might interact with what it means for the Pope to be American.
Yeah, I mean, certainly you hit the nail on the head, I think, with the continuity, because a lot of the first reactions when people were asking to the election, what does this mean? How fast it was achieved? The first word that came to mind was continuity. But continuity is the name of the game when it comes to what the papacy really represents. It's to also transmit that faith, that positive faith, those traditions in the sense of continuity. And so one thing I'm thinking is if we kind of even roll back and we see the effects in Vatican II with already, these cardinals and bishops that were active in Vatican II that eventually became future popes and cardinals of various importance from all around the world. But I think it starts to happen really at the beginning of the previous century. And funny, well, I think we're from the previous century. Most of us are perhaps to think that, yeah, well, we're there. But I'm thinking because since the beginning of the last century, in a certain way, the reality of the New World, North and South America, and all the other areas that we might deem as New World, even in Asia and Africa as well, seems to have started to catch up with the College of Cardinals. I'm thinking right away, the first Latin American cardinal was from Brazil. It would have been Cardinal Arcoverde. And he was the first Latin American, we can say, cardinal to vote at a papal conclave, and that was in 1914. The first U.S. cardinal and first cardinal from North America really to vote in a conclave was Cardinal James Gibbons in 1903. And then the first Asian and African cardinals vote in the 1950s and the 1960s. And so we see a trend. I mean, we're also talking about the pace of the church, which you're looking, I guess, through the timeline of thousands of years goes at a snail's pace. But we see how a momentum, I think, is being built as we start seeing this participation, a greater participation from what was the New World from centuries past. Now, it's not to say, like you said, we're going to start predicting where the next pope will come from, but I think we can see a trend. I think we can see this movement, slow as it may be, but certainly a trending towards this church, the modern church of the New World, even though the New World might be something that's so it's considered an arcane or an ancient thought for us. Certainly trending towards that greater participation, which is obvious now. I mean, this conclave, we see that is perhaps the most international in this participation. More or less, and there was, we could say, a grand, plus or minus a few would have been mostly a general equal representation from the traditional four corners of the world, Asia, America, Africa, and Europe. When you looked at the new cardinals, especially the new cardinals that were voting, and the majority of the cardinals that were voting, this is their first conclave. It did seem to be an equal representation of new cardinals coming in from all around the world. So certainly, I don't think the first thing on their mind, like you were mentioning, Father Sam, was, oh, let's get an American, or what nationality are we going to vote for? No, it seemed to have been something so certainly accidental. But yet there's a baggage that nationality brings, and I don't think we can ignore it. And an interesting thing I've seen is at least that suspicion of citizenship clashing with church responsibility, clashing with ministry. If you, I think it's getting quashed even more now. In a similar way, in Italy, just after Italy was founded in the mid 1800s, and going on towards the late 1800s and the early 1900s, there was a movement within Italy and some of the other secular states thinking that good Catholics could not participate in secular governments because it was antithetical one to the other. And it was Pope Leo XIII who writes in one of his, in a letter, Christiane Sapientiae, in the early 1900s, that in fact mentions that Catholics must participate in government. It is a duty. It's a way of helping guiding a secular government so it doesn't fall in error. And so there was this one suspicion that, well, a good Catholic can serve in a secular government. We had the same thing too in the United States. I mean, think about the election of John F. Kennedy. I mean, the questions that would come up of him being the first Catholic president. Where would his loyalties be? Would he be seeking guidance from Rome and things? It was even as recent as 2017 with the hearings for Justice Amy Coney Bryant. I'm sorry, Sorry, I messed up.
Barrett, Amy Coney Barrett.
Barrett, yes. Senator Feinstein, I believe, had made a question about her faith, and it seems that might be trouble. That certain tenets of the faith or being a Catholic might somehow disqualify you from high office. It's weird because conversely, there was the opposite suspicion that again was largely accepted. That well, then somebody from the U.S. could not fulfill a high church position because, well, what loyalties are, what baggage are they bringing in, what kind of representation or whatnot might come along with it. But hopefully, we'll see with Pope Leo the 14th that just as Leo the 13th urged the church to remain active in the secular state, and successfully so, Leo the 14th could show us how a Christian that's raised in a secular state, as well as our country is secular as well, can also serve the church in a high capacity, and quash a lot of these biases and presumptions.
Yeah, I think it's going to be very, very interesting to see how Leo the 14th's background, the fact that he was formed and raised in the church in the United States, will unfold and will be received as, I think, really as a gift by the rest of the church. At least that's what I hope for, and I think I certainly see indications in that direction. Because I think one of the things that helps characterize the American church, maybe particularly in the modern world and in the life of the worldwide church, is that we in the United States have a very particular experience of being sort of in between the expectations of political structures and ecclesial structures. And Catholics did not fit really well into either set of expectations. So certainly in the US, up until at least the JFK presidency, there was this deep skepticism of could Catholics fit into American political freedom. Earlier than that, of course, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there's this profound anti-Catholic bias that's also an anti-immigrant bias that in some ways we're seeing recycled now. Irish need not apply signs and things like that. And it took a while for Catholics to convince the rest of the US that we could be good Americans. Well, at the same time, there's a Catholic suspicion of Americans, even of American Catholics. So in fact, we have that, the beautiful letter from Leo the 13th calling for Catholics to participate even in secular government. We also have Leo the 13th defining still what's a pretty fuzzy definition, but a heresy called Americanism, which is largely about individualism in religion and sort of not needing the authority of the church, basically. And there was skepticism in Rome that the American church was going to push the whole Catholic Church towards a kind of individualism that wouldn't be compatible with Catholicism. I mean, I think it's one of the sort of beautiful ironies of Providence that we have, a pope who defined the heresy of Americanism, and then the next pope to take his name is himself an American. God writes straight with crooked lines. But I think that one of the gifts that the U.S. church brings in its identity and that Leo brings is that we have in the U.S. a local church that was born out of missionary and immigrant activity, and had to figure out how to articulate itself in a culture that was not dependent on it in the same way that the cultures of sort of Western European Christendom or the colonial systems that had been founded by Catholic countries were. The Catholic Church in the US is not sort of in charge of the religious culture of the country, where we exist, so to speak. I don't love the phrase, but we exist in the religious marketplace side by side with other religious identities and other religious cultures. So, the US Catholic Church, I don't think, has ever been fully at peace in the secular order that surrounds it, but it's had to figure out how to live in it in a different way than the churches that descended from the fully established churches of the medieval period had to figure it out. I also think it's fascinating, and I'm really eager to see what comes of it, that Leo is a child of the post-Vatican II U.S. Catholic Church. Um, and I think maybe perhaps the first generation of U.S. Catholics who could feel fully American themselves, who didn't have this same kind of anti-Catholic suspicion hanging over them. And what he does with that being able to feel fully at home, is he goes out as a missionary. Um, he goes to another culture and learns to be deeply rooted there. So, one of the things I'm excited to see from Leo and excited to see what it means in his papacy is that I think this is sort of a renewed way of understanding the church's universality, because the gifts of enculturation and this missionary and immigrant dimension in the church's life are now not just out at the margins, like the church embracing the full spread of go out to the edges of the four corners of the world. The church has done that, and now the gifts of that universality being spread out are being gathered back in, brought back to the center. Um, and so I hope and I think that it is providential that some of the particular gifts of the U.S. church, in order to be gathered up back in Rome, first had to pass through this prism of missionary activity and go to Peru on the way there. So that isn't prediction. I don't have any really specific model of what I think Leo will do, either in theology or church policy, but I think that's some of the perspective that he's going to bring, the way he sees the universality of the church, from the inside and in a pretty profoundly interesting way. He's seen it from a lot of different angles. And I think that's going to bode very, very well for his ministry as Pope.
Yeah, certainly it's hard to predict where he's going because he's on vacation right now. So he's
And honestly, I
in
have to say,
charge
as a journalist who covered Francis, God bless Pope Leo for taking some vacation and letting the rest of us take some vacation too.
with him. Yeah.
Absolutely fantastic. Thank you for your interchange. We've titled this interchange, this dialogue between the two of you, as how the conclave shapes the world. But in some of your comments, it seems that the conclave has been shaped by the world. And I'm reminded of Jesuit theologian Karl Rahner, who would have spoke of church history. The first 3 centuries were based around the Mediterranean. The next 16 centuries were European. And then since Vatican II, the church is more international. So let me ask, how do you think the world then has shaped the conclave?
Well, one thing I would say there, and I'm not sure how profound this is, but I think the speed of the conclave has actually a lot to do with secular expectations and the degree of media focus and world attention that is present at the conclave. I think the cardinals, and I don't think they feel this in sort of an anxious way, but I think they realize that the whole world is watching and waiting, and it provides them a lot of incentive to more incentive, in fact, than we in the media expected or detected at first, but to figure out a lot of stuff ahead of time and to come to consensus pretty quickly once they're actually locked into the Sistine Chapel. I think because they want to be able to show the rest of the world one of the classic theological marks of the church, the unity of the church, that we're able to find the next pope quickly and joyfully and come together to support the man who will lead the church into its next, through its next 15, 20 plus years. So I think that certainly has an impact on the conclave.
Yeah, certainly thinking in some other episodes from history of when the world really kind of shaped how the conclave ran, and so I mean, you go to the classic origins of the conclave itself in the Middle Ages, when they were taking so long that the public got impatient, forced all the cardinals to go in, locked them in, took the roof off even of the building, and wouldn't just give them bread and water until they finally came to a decision. It seems, yeah, the church is willing to be molded. I mean, certainly pushed, even shoved, when need be, to get to that point. One thing, though, I did notice, and it struck me in this conclave and even the previous one, is certainly the liberty with which it moved.
Mm.
There, when the Pope has passed and he is really the central authority. I mean, a lot of things do hinge on him. It really is. It's a voluntary act of the cardinals to organize themselves, and there's no overarching authority that says, "Okay, now you must do this." No, they know what they have to do. They have to figure it out themselves, and they did it. And to see just that voluntariness and being at the mass and seeing the mass, especially the first mass to open the conclave, there is no pope. You don't
Yeah.
have that unifying that presence in there, but they're all there. They're all there. They know what they have to do. No one's telling them what they have to do. They've come on their own accord. And I think, yeah, and the whole world is watching them. I mean, the whole world is watching this mass. The whole world is standing outside in that plaza. I mean, when I was in that plaza, I was surrounded by people from countries I had never met before in my life, and seeing there standing outside holding vigil, and I think also as a reminder to the ones and say, hey, we're waiting on you. And
Yeah.
but certainly there in procedure wise, and you've seen the ways of things have changed also. Kind of one of the more famous ones, those who've seen the film Conclave, they would talk about the blacking out of the media and of scrambling of phones and whatnot. I mean, that's a reality, and this
And cell
to be
phones did
sequestered, and
stop working when the conclave started,
yeah,
by the way. We were in the square and you couldn't get a signal. And
yeah,
it was,
signal
yeah.
dropped right away. And
Um,
so, yeah, I mean, these are realities that the world does shape, and the church is open also to be molded in that.
and I
That's
also think,
Mhm.
one of the most beautiful moments, and certainly something I will carry with me from the experience of being there is in between, it was about an hour or so from the white smoke to the Habemus Papam announcement from the balcony and actually meeting Leo as Pope for the first time. And we now know that hour
Mhm.
was he was writing that really beautiful speech he gave before the Urbi et Orbi blessing was one of
Mhm.
the things he was doing during that time. But how joyful people were for an hour when we knew we had a Pope and we had no idea who he was.
Yeah,
That was
yeah,
really powerful.
that's something beautiful to watch. And a lot of things you'll see on TV, they did capture those images of the reactions, of the expectation, of people starting to sing, and really a shout for joy. And yet we
Mhm.
don't know who it is yet, but we're happy that we have a pope. And I think there really it captures also that continuity. We need a pope. We need someone there. And it becomes the answer to a prayer. And many, obviously, to the ones who were in there voting, they were praying also as well. There's an answer to their prayer. There was an answer to prayer to all the people who were praying for that conclave in there. And so sometimes we do get to see our prayers answered right in front of us, live on TV.
well, you've both spoken about continuity several times, and we had a question that came in online that said one of the points of continuity is that we have now two popes consecutively who are members of religious orders. Francis, of course, being a Jesuit, and Pope Leo the 14th having been a member of and the leader of the Augustinians. What do you think is at play? Having, or what do you see in that the church again has, the conclave chose a member of a religious order to serve as pope?
So I'm going to quote here America's Vatican correspondent, Jerry O'Connell, who was very close to Pope Francis, literally wrote the book on the last conclave, is currently deeply at work on the book on this conclave. But what Jerry had to say about this, he said this in a conversation we had on one of our podcasts right after the conclave, that the church sometimes turns to the religious orders as sources of renewal and reform. So when the church needs to figure out how to enter a new space or a new era, that the religious orders often are a source of that renewal in the church. And that's how he read both the Francis papacy and the election of Leo out of the Augustinians, which I think is, yeah, that made sense to me, and I think is a pretty accurate read of things.
I see, and certainly that was a point that came up right away, even when considering who would be, who could possibly be Pope. Another thing that people wrote off right away was religious. It was like, well, we've already had a religious Pope, a Jesuit, the first Jesuit Pope. Well, we're not going to do it twice, so they're not going to go to a religious order again. But then here we are. I perceive almost a blurring of lines in the strict difference between the two. And I think it's also a result of Vatican II, of the changes and kind of the aggiornamento for religious life as well, that it becomes even more integrated into the larger scope of church life, not as something that's separate or parallel, but interwoven in it, almost that it overlaps in it. And the fact that we have two now religious popes that are coming from religious orders, two in a row, might be that line's getting blurred so much that it's not that different. I mean, certainly there are the particular charisms and gifts that are proper to each order and even to life as a diocesan priest, but maybe it's not as so distinct as might have been at one point.
So you both spoke about this sense of being present, and there was a time where we knew we had a pope but didn't know who the pope was, and we didn't know the name of the pope. And so there are many people who talk about how we have been shaped by moving from Pope Leo the 13th to now Pope Leo the 14th. Now, Pope Leo the 13th certainly had a significant role in Catholic social teaching. What implications do you see for the church going forward with Robert Prevost choosing the name Leo the 14th?
So yeah, I think Father Christian can certainly speak to this from the perspective of a church historian more deeply, but I'll just name two things that I see going on there. The first, of course, so Leo the 13th, I think there's a rhyme between what Leo the 13th initiated with Rerum Novarum and the modern Catholic social teaching tradition and Vatican II, in the sense that both were big structural attempts to help the church engage more constructively with the contemporary social and cultural reality. So, in other words, that didn't just start happening at Vatican II. A very profound thread of it started happening under Leo the 13th, as with Rerum Novarum, he's trying to help the church understand and engage with the social and economic conditions brought about by the Industrial Revolution and the rise of the modern nation state and democratic political structures, and how we understand what solidarity and responsibility for the common good looks like and how it operates under those conditions. So I think in that sense, like rooting us not just in how the church lives out of Vatican II, but also how the church lives out of this bigger and deeper project of engaging with the contemporary world around it in a constructive and not just a standoffish way. I'm excited about that. And of course, the other thing Leo himself has said is that he sees the AI revolution that we're in the middle of as sort of an analog in some ways to the massive transformation of the Industrial Revolution, and he's concerned about that as well.
Yeah, certainly, I think Leo the 13th gives us the theory. And remember, Leo the 13th was still practically a prisoner of the Vatican at that time, at a time after Pius IX that really the relation between Italy, the new secular state, and the Holy See was still being defined at that moment. And he was famously known for being one of the first to venture out in so many years from the area of the Vatican into the city of Rome to visit a church, which would have been a big deal for us today, but it was a big deal over a century ago. But that he laid down a theory, certainly a perception of you, made some warnings about the world that I think someone like Cardinal Robert Prevost would have lived through these things. I mean, he went through the practice of the praxis, if you will, of this, going outside into this world, into the world of that was affected very much by that industrial revolution, still is affected very much by a lot of social concerns. He got his hands dirty in there, so to say, and now he's come back again. I think we can have in him certainly a real time reflection on this on that teaching, which was been celebrated over the decades. I mean, there was always in 15 years there was a document that was released on its 100 years as well. And so I think we're going to be getting a more real time, in a certain way, reflection of the actualities of it. And certainly AI, I think, is going to be the new. I mean, if the Industrial Revolution and working conditions were the big thing, the new turn at the turn of the century. Well, in our century now, certainly artificial intelligence, I think, is something that's going to touch many things, especially in the social aspect. It certainly is already making its inroads there.
The other thing that I think might be worth saying there is, Francis's particular what Pope Francis added to the tradition of Catholic social teaching in the line of Rerum Novarum, I think probably most significantly Laudato Si, adding, expanding the realm of Catholic social teaching to also involve care for creation, and then in Fratelli Tutti, giving us a real articulation of what he refers to as social fraternity, but a sort of a contemporary meditation on how, as a not just as an ecclesial body, but also as a social body, how we care for each other, and particularly how we care for the least among us. So, Francis, of course, highlighted concern for refugees, and linked that in both with the people who will bear the effects of climate change and the people who are sort of at the margins of our social concern. I would expect to see those threads picked up by Leo as well in his articulation of Catholic social teaching, because we should remember it's not just, the Catholic social teaching tradition didn't start with Leo the 13th and then kind of it has been renewed by each successive pope, and very deliberately so. And there's, I think, a sense in which you understand it. It's not like Rerum Novarum is the one true heart of it, right? It has been rearticulated over and over again, precisely in order to be that current constructive engagement of the church with the social situations around it.
One final question before we go. I know you've spoken about, who Robert Prevost is and where he came from. But amidst questions of identity and nationality, how do you both see the role of the Holy Spirit in the conclave as it unfolded?
Well, certainly one of the perhaps memorable quotes of Pope Francis was always he would like to talk about the God of surprises, and certainly I think this is a great surprise in many aspects. Not only surprising where he's from, in his background, his religious background as member of the Augustinian order. Certainly, I think we've got that surprise since the Holy Spirit left us, and it was very well received. It's been very well received. And again, looking at the faces, remembering the faces of people in the plaza, even when we didn't know who it was yet, there was the surprise that the Holy Spirit is giving to the faithful, and a church that was welcoming in it.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that sense of surprise, and I particularly like the point about both the surprise of who the Pope is, and then also the surprise of how well and joyfully it's been received by the church at large. I also think about, first, I think it's important to recognize how deeply the cardinals are praying through the conclave. Like there's these bookend moments at the funeral. So just before the cardinals are, in earnest in their pre-conclave general congregation meetings, we sing the Litany of the Saints for Pope Francis as he's being buried. And then at the beginning of the conclave, as they're processing to the Sistine Chapel, we see the litany of the saints for the cardinals as they elect the next pope. And I know that many cardinals in their comments after the conclave spoke about how powerfully they felt the prayer of the church and the world carrying them along. But I think also, they're praying very deeply through it. So they're not just politicking in there. That's the part that's sort of easy and possible for the media to cover.
Mhm.
And especially when you bring a lot of secular journalists to Rome who are, sort of their bread and butter, what they're most experienced doing in some ways is political coverage and elections. That tends to be where they go. And we do a lot of like, well, which continents are going to vote for who and this sort of thing. But I would try to remind folks in the secular media when I got to comment there that one of the profoundly interesting things about the conclave is that it requires a 2/3 consensus to elect anybody, which means that somebody absolutely has to change a lot of somebodies have to change their mind in order for us to get a pope. And that doesn't have a solid analog in any contemporary political reality. So I think the Holy Spirit also moves through that. The fact that people have to change their mind, and then turn out to be really joyful about having done so. And I guess I would say, would that more of us could learn that lesson in realms other than the election of a pope.
Certainly there's that openness to it. We famously would say in U.S. history, compromise, compromise, compromise is how a lot of the country was founded on, but not compromise in a political sense that, well, I'll get mine back later. Certainly there's this openness that was there to the Holy Spirit, to that movement. And it's an openness that creates joy. I mean, I think we are seeing an authentic joy.
Right. Like a real commonality here, and not just a sort of what's the least thing I can eke out.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both, Father Christian and Father Sam, for leading us in this discussion, this dialogue tonight. It's been absolutely enlightening. We're grateful for all the people who have been able to log on to enjoy the fruits of your commentary. And so I'd just simply like to again say thank you to you and to our audience. Thank you to Bill Whalen, the chair of our trustees, for leading us off this evening, and for the staff of the Gregorian University, Colleen Phelan, Colleen Mudlaff, Tricia Lloyd, and Father Bill George, for all your support in bringing this about. A final reminder, our chair said it well, that the Gregorian University Foundation raises funds to support the Gregorian University in Rome, and in doing so, builds up the university so the Gregorian University can build up the life of the church and the world that we inhabit. It happens at many levels. We know that many graduates of the Gregorian University have gone on to become pope, to serve as cardinals or as bishops, serve in Vatican offices or dicasteries, but also, as Bill said, leading us off, most of our graduates go out to lead in the church, in our parishes, our schools, and other Catholic organizations. So thank you to all of the people who have logged in tonight and who support the Gregorian University Foundation. You help us support the Gregorian University and the Universal Evangelical Catholic Church. Thank you all. I hope you have a wonderful evening.